It was October 14th, 1998, just outside a small construction site on the edge of Clay County, Nebraska, when the ground gave way beneath $200,000 worth of steel and pride. The crane went down slowly at first. No one noticed. Not the operator hid in the cab, not the engineers. Arguing over load distribution. Not even Daniel Reeves, the man who owned the entire project and most of the land around it. They were too busy watching the steel beam swing into place, too busy believing everything was under control. Then the front left track sank, just 2 inches, then 6, and then the earth swallowed it like it had been waiting all morning. By the time someone shouted, it was already too late. The crane tilted groaned under its own weight, and the entire job site froze in a silence so sudden it felt unnatural. Men started running. Orders were shouted. Engines roared as they tried to compensate, tried to stabilize it. But the more they fought it, the deeper it sank. And about 50 yards away, rolling slowly along the dirt road, was a man they had laughed at not even an hour earlier. His name was Elias Carter, and he was driving a machine older than every man on that site. What no one there understood yet was that before the day was over, they would have to swallow their pride and call him back. But to understand why, you have to go back just a little further. Earlier that same morning, the fog still clung low over the fields when Elias first came down that road. His steam tractor announced itself before anyone saw it. Deep, rhythmic, almost alive. The kind of sound that didn't belong in a world of diesel engines and hydraulic precision. It was big, iron-wheeled, blackened by decades of use and weather. A relic from another time, and in the eyes of most people there, a joke. Elias sat high on the seat, his back slightly bent, but steady hands calm on the controls. He didn't look at the construction site as he passed, but they noticed him immediately. One of the younger engineers laughed. Sound first. What the hell is that A museum piece? Another joined in louder this time. Hey, you planning to plow with that thing or start a parade? A few of the workers stopped what they were doing just to watch. It wasn't every day you saw something like that still moving under its own power. Then Daniel Reeves stepped forward. He was a tall man. Clean boots, pressed shirt. The kind of man who wore confidence like armor. He didn't laugh right away. He just looked at Elias at the tractor and shook his head with a thin smile. Sir Reeves called out loud enough for everyone to hear. You know they've invented machines this century that actually work right. That got the biggest laugh. Elias slowed the tractor just slightly, not enough to stop, just enough to acknowledge the voice. For a moment it seemed like he might respond, but he didn't. He simply turned his head, met Reeves' eyes briefly, and gave a small, almost respectful nod. Then he looked forward again and kept going. The laughter followed him down the road. Probably takes him all day to go 5 miles. Someone shouted. Things got more rust than power, another added. And just like that, the moment passed. To them, it was nothing more than a bit of morning entertainment. But there was something none of them understood. Something quiet. Something buried deeper than the mud they were about to fight. Because that machine wasn't just old. And that man wasn't just a farmer. Elias Carter had been born in 1938 on the very same stretch of land that bordered that construction site. Back when the soil was harder, the winters longer, and people didn't have the luxury of replacing things just because they wore out. His father, Thomas Carter, had been a mechanic by necessity, not by trade. When something broke, you fixed it. If you didn't know how, you learned. And Elias learned early. He learned by watching hands that never rushed, by listening to the subtle differences in engine sounds most people couldn't even hear, by understanding that machines, real machines, didn't just run on fuel. They ran on balance pressure timing and respect. The steam tractor came into his life before he could even reach its controls. It had belonged to his grandfather, a man who had used it to pull lumber, to build roads, to drag entire barns into place when the land was still being shaped by men instead of machines. By the time Elias inherited it, most people thought it was already obsolete. Too slow, too heavy, too complicated. But what they saw as limitations, Elias saw differently. Because what that tractor had, what modern machines didn't, was raw, steady torque, not the kind that came in bursts, not the kind that failed when conditions weren't perfect, but the kind that built slowly. And once it held, it didn't let go. And over the years, Elias had done something else, something no one ever noticed. He had modified it, quietly, patiently, adjusting the boiler pressure, reinforcing the dry, tuning it not for speed, but for pulling power under strain. He never talked about it, never showed it off, because to him it wasn't special. It was just what the machine needed to be, and maybe that's the part that matters most. Because this story isn't really about an old tractor, and it's not even about a crane stuck in the mud. It's about something people forget too easily, something that doesn't show itself until everything else fails. And by the time they realized it that day, they were already running out of options. Back at the construction site, the ground had already swallowed nearly half of the crane's left track. What began as a minor shift had turned into something far worse. The soil beneath wasn't just soft, it was layered with old irrigation runoff. Years of waterlogged sediment compressed beneath a thin crust that looked stable but couldn't hold concentrated weight. The kind of ground that punished confidence. And Daniel Reeves had built his entire operation on confidence. Stabilize it. He barked, his voice sharp, cutting through the noise. Get another rig over here now. A second truck was brought in, chains, rattling engines roaring as they tried to pull the crane free. The cables tightened, strained, and then snapped loose with a violent crack that sent everyone stepping back. The crane didn't move. It sank another inch. A murmur spread through the crowd. Not panic yet, but close. One of the engineers wiped sweat from his forehead, staring down at the ground like it had betrayed him. This shouldn't be happening, he muttered. The load calculations were solid, but the ground didn't care about calculations. And for the first time that morning, Reeves stopped talking. He just stood there, watching as his machine, his investment, his reputation, slowly disappeared into the earth. Time passed differently in moments like that. Each minute stretched longer, heavier. Every failed attempt made the next one feel more desperate. They tried widening the base. They tried offloading the weight. They tried reinforcing the ground. Nothing worked. And somewhere in the middle of that growing tension, a voice, quiet, uncertain, cut through. There was a guy earlier. Reeves didn't turn. What guy? The old man. With the steam tractor. A few others looked up. Recognition flickered. The one you were talking to, the worker added carefully. Reeves exhaled through his nose, irritated. That thing, he scoffed. That's not going to solve this. But the worker didn't back down this time. I've seen those before, he said. My grandfather had one. They don't spin like these modern rigs. They pull. Steady. Another older man nearby nodded slowly. He's right, he said. Those engines build torque different, slow, but once they bite, they don't let go. Reeves turned now, not convinced, but listening. And that was new, because just an hour ago, he wouldn't have entertained the idea for even a second. But things had changed. The crane had sunk deeper. The options had grown thinner. And pride was starting to feel expensive. Still, he hesitated, because calling that man back after the way he'd been treated meant something more than just solving a problem. It meant admitting he might have been wrong. And that was something Daniel Reeves wasn't used to doing. I need to stop here for a second. The voice of the story almost seems to say, as if leaning closer, because this moment, this hesitation, is where most people fail. Not because they don't have solutions, but because they refuse to see them. And what happened next is the part that began to shift everything. Another 5 minutes passed. The crane sank again. Not much, but enough. Enough to silence the last bit of confidence left on that site. Reeves looked around, at the engineers who no longer had answers, at the workers who were now just watching, at the machine that refused to obey. And finally, he said it. Find him. No one moved at first. Then, one of the younger guys grabbed the keys to a pickup truck and sped off down the dirt road, chasing a man they had laughed at not long ago. And out on that road, just beyond the bend where the trees started to thin, Elias Carter was still moving forward. Same steady pace, same quiet rhythm, as if the world behind him didn't matter. He didn't know yet that they were coming, didn't know that everything was about to change. But maybe, part of him always expected it. Because when you spend a lifetime understanding things other people overlook, you learn something else too. You learn that sooner or later. They come back. The truck caught up to him about half a mile down. Dust rose behind it as it pulled alongside the tractor engine, whining impatiently against the slow, measured chug of steam. The young worker leaned out the window almost out of breath. "Sir, hey, sir." Elias didn't stop immediately. He eased the throttle down, letting the machine slow naturally, like it had its own sense of timing. Only when it came to a near standstill did he turn his head. The worker swallowed. There's a problem back there. The crane, it's stuck." "Bad." Elias said nothing, just listened. They think maybe you could help." There it was. Not an apology. Not yet. Just need. And that told Elias everything he needed to know. He looked back down the road for a long moment. Not at the worker, not at the truck, but at something further. Something only he seemed to see. Then he nodded once. Slow, deliberate, and without another word, he turned the tractor around. Now here's the part nobody there understood. Not the workers, not the engineers, and certainly not Daniel Reeves. Because when Elias agreed to come back, it wasn't to prove them wrong. It wasn't for money. And it wasn't even really about the crane. It was about something older than all of that. Something his father had told him once standing beside that same machine decades ago. You don't walk away from a job that needs doing, just because the people asking don't understand you. And that's the kind of lesson that doesn't show itself until moments like this. As Elias made his way back toward the site, the sound of the steam engine rolled ahead of him like distant thunder. Slow, steady, unchanging, and back at the construction site, every head turned as that sound returned. The same machine, the same man, but this time, no one laughed. Reeves stood at the edge of the mud, arms crossed, watching as Elias approached. There was something different in his posture now. Less certainty, more restraint. The tractor came to a stop a few yards away. Steam hissed softly into the cool air. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then Reeves stepped forward. "We've got a situation," he said, his tone controlled, but lacking the sharp edge from before. "Crane's stuck." Ground gave out. Elias looked past him, at the machine, at the soil, at the angle. His eyes moved slowly, taking everything in, measuring, understanding. And when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet. "You've been pulling straight," he said. It wasn't a question. One of the engineers stepped in, slightly defensive. "That's the most efficient force application given the position." Elias didn't look at him. Not in this ground. A small silence followed that. Not confrontational, but heavy. Because for the first time that day, someone had said something that sounded like certainty. Real certainty. Not based on theory, but on experience. Elias climbed down from the tractor. His movements were slow, deliberate, like a man who never wasted energy. He walked out onto the edge of the mud, crouched, slightly pressed his boot into the soil. Then he looked back at Reeves. "You don't need more power," he said. A pause. "You need patience." And that was the moment the balance shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Because suddenly, the man they had laughed at was the only one who sounded like he knew exactly what he was doing. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Not the engineers, not the workers, not even Daniel Reeves. Because what Elias had just said didn't sound impressive. It didn't sound technical. It didn't sound like a solution that belonged in a $200,000 problem. You need patience. But something in the way he said it made it land differently. Elias stood up slowly, brushing the damp soil from his hands. He walked back toward his tractor, not waiting for permission, not asking for approval, as if the decision had already been made. "Run your cable from there," he said, pointing not at the front of the crane, but at an angle off to the side. "Low, not high." One of the engineers frowned. "That's going to reduce the effective pull force." Elias shook his head slightly. "No," he said. "It'll change where the ground lets go." That sentence lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Because it is about force anymore. It was about understanding. There's a difference between pulling something out and knowing how it's being held in. The crew hesitated. Then Reeves spoke. "Do it." No argument, no hesitation this time, because something had shifted in him, too. The cable was rerouted, dragged through the mud, hooked lower, tighter angled differently than before. It didn't look as powerful. It didn't look impressive, but it looked intentional. Elias climbed back onto the steam tractor. He didn't rush, didn't dramatize the moment. He reached for the controls the same way he always had steady, familiar, almost quiet. Then he opened the valve. The tractor came alive, not with a roar, but with a deep rolling pressure, like something waking up from a long sleep. Steam pushed through the system building slowly. The metal creaked. The pistons began their rhythm, and the massive iron wheels settled into the earth with a weight that felt grounded, not aggressive, not frantic, just certain. And this is the part people remember differently, depending on where they stood that day. Because at first, nothing happened. The cable tightened. The machine pulled, but the crane didn't move. A few of the workers exchanged looks. One of the engineers shook his head slightly, as if to say, "We've seen this before." Even Reeves felt it, that familiar doubt creeping back in. Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe they were just wasting time. But Elias didn't stop. He didn't increase the speed, didn't force it. He just let the pressure build, slowly, quietly, like he was listening to something no one else could hear. And then, the ground shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a subtle release. A small, almost invisible change beneath the surface. But Elias felt it. His hand adjusted the valve just a fraction, and the tractor responded. The wheels dug in deeper, gripping instead of spinning. The cable tightened further, humming with tension. And this time, the crane moved. Barely. Just enough for one man to notice. Wait. Then another inch. Then another. The mud resisted, clung, tried to hold on. But it wasn't a sudden pull that broke it free. It was consistency. Relentless, steady force applied in exactly the right direction. The kind of force that doesn't shock the system. It persuades it. And then in one long, breath-held moment, the crane rose. Slowly, painfully, but undeniably. The buried track broke free from the mud with a wet, heavy sound, and the entire machine shifted back onto stable ground. No snapping cables, no roaring engines, just release. For a second, the entire site went silent, as if no one quite believed what they had just seen. Then someone let out a laugh, not mocking this time, disbelieving. And just like that, the silence broke. Voices rose. Men stepped forward. Some clapped, others just stood there, shaking their heads. And Daniel Reeves didn't move at all. He just stared at the crane, then at the tractor, then finally at Elias, the man who had done in minutes what his entire team couldn't do in hours. The same man he had laughed at, the same machine he had dismissed. And in that moment, there was no clever response, no excuse, no way to turn it into something else. Because the truth had already made itself clear. The thing they had underestimated had just saved them. Elias eased the tractor to a stop. Steam hissed gently as the pressure settled. He sat there for a moment, as if waiting to make sure the job was truly done. Then he climbed down. No celebration, no prideful look, just the quiet satisfaction of something being set right. Reeves walked toward him, slower this time. Different. He started, then stopped, because whatever he had been about to say didn't seem enough, so he tried again. That was impressive. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing he had. Elias nodded once. "You pulled too hard," he said simply. Ground needed time to let go. Reeves gave a short, almost humorless laugh. "Cost me a lot to learn that." Elias looked back at the crane. "Could have cost more." Another silence. Then Reeves straightened slightly. "How much?" he asked. Elias turned his head. For the help, Reeves clarified. "Name your price." And this was the moment everyone expected to go a certain way. The moment where the quiet man finally claims his reward. Where the story becomes about money. But Elias just shook his head. "It's done," he said. Reeves frowned. "That machine of yours," he gestured toward the tractor. "I'll buy it. 50,000. A few heads turned. That was more than the machine should have been worth. On paper, Elias didn't even look at it. Number. Reeves blinked. 75. Number. Now there was something unfamiliar in Reeves's expression. Not anger, not arrogance, something closer to confusion. "Why not?" he asked. And Elias paused, just for a moment, long enough that when he spoke, it didn't sound like an answer rehearsed. It sounded like something lived. "Because you see a machine," he said quietly. Then he placed a hand on the side of the tractor, almost absent-mindedly. I see everything that kept it running. That was it. No lecture, no explanation. But it was enough, because suddenly it wasn't about steel and steam anymore. It was about time, about hands that had worked on it, about lessons that had been passed down without ever being written. Reeves didn't argue again, because for the first time that day, he understood that there were things he couldn't buy. And as Elias climbed back onto the tractor, turning it slowly toward the road he had come from, no one laughed. No one said a word. They just watched as the same old machine, the same quiet man, rolled away, leaving behind something far heavier than a crane, pulled from the mud. He left behind a lesson, one that settled slowly, but stayed long after the ground had hardened again, because what happened that day wasn't really about a machine. And it wasn't even about saving money. It was about the cost of arrogance and the quiet strength of something most people don't recognize. Until